History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3 The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 3 Greek Civilization. Women, too, were excluded from citizenship, though it is hazardous to generalize any further about their legal rights. In Athens, for example, they could neither inherit nor own property, though both were possible in Sparta, nor could they undertake a business transaction if more than the value of a bushel of grain was involved. Divorce at the suit of the wife was, it is true, available to the Athenian women, but it seems to have been rare and was probably practically much harder to obtain than it was by men, who seem to have been able to get rid of wives fairly easily. Literary evidence suggests that the wives, other than those of rich men, lived, for the most part, the lives of drudges. The social assumptions that governed all women's behavior were very restrictive. Even women of the upper classes stayed at home in seclusion for most part of the time. If they ventured out, they had to be accompanied to be seen at a banquet, but put their respectability in question. Entertainers and courtesans were the only women who could normally expect a public life. They could enjoy a certain celebrity, but a respectable woman could not. Significantly, in classical Greece, girls were thought unworthy of education. Such attitudes suggest the primitive atmosphere of the society out of which they grew, one very different from, say, Minoan Crete among its predecessors or later Rome. So far as sexuality is revealed by literature, Greek marriage and parenthood could produce deep feeling and as high a mutual regard between individual men and women as in our own societies. One element in it, which is nowadays hard to weigh up exactly, was a tolerated and even romanticized male homosexuality. Convention regulated this. In many Greek cities, it was acceptable for young upper class males to have love affairs with older men. Interestingly, there is much less evidence in Greek literature of homosexual love between men of the same age. This was not thought to disqualify them for subsequent heterosexual marriages. Something must be allowed for fashion in this, but all societies can provide examples of homosexual relationships which suit many men at one stage of their lives. Those of the ancient Greeks have attracted undue attention, perhaps because of the absence of inhibitions and controls which made the expression of homosexual affection improper in other societies, and because the general prestige of their civilization has rubbed off on even its minor embodiments. At root, it may only have been a function of the restrictions which segregated and circumscribed the lives of free women. In this, as in everything else, we know much more about the behavior of the elite than about that of most Greeks. Citizenship, which must often have spanned very different social levels in practice, is a category too big to permit generalizations. Even in democratic Athens, the kind of man who rose in public life and of whom, therefore, we read in the records was usually a landowner. He was not likely to be a businessman, far less a craftsman. A craftsman might be important as a member of his group in the assembly, but he could hardly make his way to leadership. Businessmen may have been handicapped by the long ingrained conviction of the upper class Greeks that trade and industry were no proper occupations for a gentleman, who should ideally live a life of cultivated leisure based on the revenues of his lands. This was a view which was to pass into Europe tradition with important effect. Social history therefore blurs into politics. The Greek preoccupation with political life, the life of the polis, and the fact that classical Greece is neatly delimited by two distinct epochs, that of the Persian Wars and that of a new Macedonian Empire, makes it easy to appreciate the importance of Greek political history to civilization. Yet, to reconstruct it in any complete sense is impossible. Many, perhaps most, English parishes have records richer than those we can recover for most of the city states of Greece. What can be discovered from the evidence is much of the history of Athens, quite a lot of that of a few other states, almost nothing of many, and a fairly full narrative of their relations with one another. Together, these facts provide us with a pretty clear picture of the political context of classical Greek civilization, but uncertainty about many of its details. Athens dominates this picture, and so there are considerable risks in arguing too readily from Athens to what was typical. What we know most about, we often tend to think most important, and because some of the greatest of the 5th century Greeks were Athenians, and Athens is one pole of the great story of the Peloponnesian War. Scholars have given its history enormous attention. Yet we also know that Athens was, to take only 2 points, both big and a commercial center. It was therefore untypical in very important ways. The temptation to overvalue Athens' culture importance is less dangerous. Such a primacy was, after all, recognized at the time. Though many of the greatest Greeks were not Athenians, and many Greeks rejected the Athenians' claims to superiority. Athenians saw themselves as leaders of Greece. Only a few of the most scrupulous among them hesitated to use the tribute of the Delian League for embellishing its leading city. Thus were built the buildings whose ruins still crown the Acropolis, the Parthenon, and Propylaea. But of course, the money spent on them was available just because so many Greek states recognized Athens' paramountcy. This reality is what the tribute lists record. When on the eve of the Peloponnesian War, Pericles told his countrymen that their state was a model for the rest of the Greece, he was indulging in propaganda, but there was also conviction in what he said. Solid grounds for the importance of traditionality given to Athens ought indeed to be suggested a priori by the basic facts of geography. Her position recalls the ancient tradition that she played an ill defined but seemingly important role in the Ionian plantation of the Aegean and Asia Minor. Easy access to this region, together with poor agricultural resources, made her a trading and maritime power early in the 6th century. Thanks to this, she was the richest of the Greek cities. At the end of it, the discovery of the silver deposits of Laurium gave her the windfall with which to rebuild the fleet of the Salamis. From the fleet came her undisputed preeminence in the Aegean and thence, eventually, the tribute which refreshed her treasury in the 5th century. The peak of her power and wealth was reached just before the Peloponnesian War, in the years when creative activity and patriotic inspiration reached their height. Pride in the extension of empire was then linked to a cultural achievement which was truly enjoyed by the people. Commerce, the navy, ideological confidence, and democracy are themes as inseparably and traditionally interwoven in the history of 5th century Athens as of the late 19th century England, though in very different ways. It was widely recognized at the time that a fleet of ships, whose movement depended ultimately upon the 200 paid oarsmen apiece, was both the instrument of imperial power and the preserve of the democracy. Hoplites were less important in a naval state than elsewhere, and no expensive armor was needed to be an oarsman. who would be paid by the tribute of the League or the proceeds of the successful warfare. As it was hoped, for example, the Sicilian expedition would prove. Imperialism was genuinely popular among Athenians, who would expect to share its profits even if only indirectly and collectively, and not to have to bear its burdens. This was an aspect of Athenian democracy which was given much attention by the critics. Attacks of Athenian democracy began in early times and have continued ever since. They have embodied as much historical misrepresentation as have overzealous and idealizing defenses of the same institutions. The misgivings of frightened conservatives who had never seen anything like it before are understandable, for democracy emerged at Athens unexpectedly and at first almost unobserved. Its roots lay in the 6th century constitutional changes which replaced the organizing principle of kinship with that of locality. In theory and law, at least, local attachment came to be more important than the family you belonged to. This was a development which appears to have been general in Greece, and it put democracy on the localized institutional basis which it has usually had ever since. Other changes followed from this. By the middle of the 5th century, all adult males were entitled to take part in the assembly and, through it, therefore, in the election of major administrative officers. The powers of the Areopagus were steadily reduced. After 462 BC, it was only a law court with jurisdiction over certain offenses. The other courts were at the same time rendered more susceptible to democratic influence by the institution of payment for jury service. As they also conducted much administrative business, this meant a fair amount of popular participation in daily running of the city. Just after the Peloponnesian War, when times were hard, pay was also offered for attendance at the assembly itself. Finally, there was the Athenian belief in selecting by lot. Its use for the choice of magistrates told against hereditary prestige and power. At the root of this constitution lay distrust of expertise and entrenched authority, and confidence in collective common sense. From this derived, no doubt, the relative lack of interest Athenians showed in rigorous jurisprudence. Argument in an Athenian court was occupied much more with questions of motive, standing, and substance than with questions of law, and the importance they gave to the skills of oratory. The effective political leaders of Athens were those who could sway their fellow citizens by their words. Whether we called them demagogues or orators does not matter. They were the first politicians seeking power by persuasion. Towards the end of the 5th century, though, even then by no means usually, some such men came from families outside the traditional ruling class. The continuing importance of old political families was nevertheless an important qualification of the democratic system. Themistocles, at the beginning of the century, and Pericles, when the war began, were members of the old families, their birth making it proper for them, even in the eyes of the conservatives, to take the lead in affairs. The old ruling classes found it easier to accept democracy because of this practical qualification of it. There is a rough parallel in the grudging acceptance of Whig reform by 19th century English aristocrats. Government in Athens, as in Victorian England, remained for a long time in the hands of men whose forefathers might have expected to rule in the state in more aristocratic days. Another tempering qualification was provided by the demands of politics on time and money. Though jurors and members of the assembly might be paid, the fee for attendance was small. It seems to have been prompted too by the need to make sure of quorum, which does not suggest that the assembly found it easy to get the mass of civil citizens to attend. Many of them must have lived too far away, and it has been calculated that not more than about 1 in 8 of them were present at the usual statutory meetings, of which some 40 were held each year. These facts tend to be lost to sight both in the denunciation and the idealization of Athenian democracy, and they go some way to explain its apparent mildness. Taxation was light, and there was little discriminatory legislation against the rich, such as we would now associate with the democratic rule, and such as Aristotle said would be the inevitable result of the rule of the poor. Even in its emergent period, Athenian democracy was identified with adventure and enterprise in foreign policy. Popular demand lay behind support for the Greek cities of Asia in their revolt against Persia. Later, for understandable reasons, it gave foreign policy an anti Spartan bias. The struggle against the Areopagus was led by Themistocles, the builder of the Athenian fleet of Salamis, who had sensed a potential danger from Sparta from the moment the Persian War was over. Thus, the responsibility for the Peloponnesian War and for its exasperation of the factions and divisions of all the other cities of Greece came to be laid at the door of democracy. It not only brought disaster upon Athens itself, its critics pointed out, but exported to or at least awoke in all Greek cities the bitterness of faction and social conflict. Oligarchy was twice restored in Athens, not that it helped matters. And by the end of the century, faith in Athenian democracy was grievously weakened. Thucydides could take his history only down to 411 BC, but it closes in misgivings and disillusion over his native city, which had exiled him. And Plato was to imprint forever upon the Athenian democrats the stigma of the execution of his teacher Socrates in 399 BC. If Athenian democracy's exclusion of women, metics, and slaves is also placed in the scale, the balance against it seems heavy to modern eyes. It looks both narrow and disastrously unsuccessful. Yet it should not disqualify Athens for the place she later won in the regard of posterity. Anachronistic and invalid comparisons are too easy. Athens is not to be compared with ideals still imperfectly realized after 2000 years, but with her contemporaries. For all the survival of the influence of the leading families and the practical impossibility that even a majority of its members would turn up to any practical particular meeting of the assembly. More Athenians were engaged in self government than was the case in any other state. Athenian democracy, more than any other institution, brought about the liberation of men from the political ties of kin, which is one of the great Greek achievements. Many who could not have contemplated office elsewhere could experience in Athens the political education of taking responsible decisions, which is the heart of political culture. Men of modest means could help to run the institutions which nurtured and protected Athens' great civilized achievement. They listened to arguments of an elevation and thoughtfulness which make it impossible to dismiss them as mere rhetoric. They must surely have weighed them seriously sometimes. Just as the physical divisions between the old Greek communities fostered a variety of experience, which led in the end to a break with the world of God given rulers and a grasp of the idea that political arrangements could be consciously chosen. So, the stimulus of participation in affairs worked on unprecedentedly large numbers of men in classical Athens, not only in the assembly but in the daily meetings of the People's Council, which prepared its business. Even without the eligibility of all citizens for office, Athenian democracy could still have been the greatest instrument of political education contrived down to that time. It is against the background that the errors, vanities, and misjudgments of Athenian politics must be seen. We do not cease to treasure the great achievements of British political culture because of the shallowness and corruptness of much of the 20th century democracy. Athens may be judged like any political system by its working at its best under the leadership of Pericles. It was outstanding. It left to posterity the myth of the individual's responsibility for his own political fate. We need myths in politics and have yet to find one better. The Athenians, in any case, would have been uninterested in many modern criticisms of their democracy. Its latter defenders and attackers have both often fallen into another sort of anachronism, that of misinterpreting the goals Greeks thought worth achieving. Greek democracy, for example, was far from being dominated, as is ours, by the mythology of cooperativeness and cheerfully paid a larger price in destructiveness than would be welcomed today. There was a blatant competitiveness in Greek life apparent from the Homeric poems onwards. Greeks admired men who won and thought men should strive to win. The consequent release of human power was colossal, but also dangerous. The ideal expressed in the much used word, which was inadequately translated as virtue, illustrates this. When Greeks used it, they meant that people were able, strong, quick witted as much as they were just, principled, or virtuous in a modern sense. Homer's hero, Odysseus, frequently behaved like a rogue, but he is brave and clever, and he succeeds. He is therefore admirable. To show such quality was good. It is not a matter that the social cost might sometimes be high. The Greek was concerned with image. His culture taught him to avoid shame rather than guilt, and the fear of shame was never far from the fear of public evidence of guilt. Some of the explanation of the bitterness of faction in Greek politics lies here. It was a price willingly paid. When all is said, Athenian democracy must be respected above all, for it cradled a series of cultural triumphs which are peaks even in the history of Greek civilization. These were public facts. The art of Athens was applauded and sustained by many men. The tragedies were tested not by the takings of a box office but by the judges interpreting a public taste vigorously expressed. The sculptor Phidias worked to beautify the city and not for an individual patron. And as democracy degenerated, so it seems there was a waning of artistic nerve. This was a loss to the whole of Greece. The achievement which made Greece teacher of Europe and through it of the world is too rich and varied to generalize about even in long and close study. It is impossible to summarize in a page or so, but there is a salient theme which emerges in it, a growing confidence in rational, conscious inquiry. If civilization is advanced towards the control of mentality and environment by reason, then the Greeks did more for it than any of their predecessors. They invented the philosophical question as part and parcel of one of the great intuitions of all time, that a coherent and logical explanation of things could be found, that the world did not ultimately rest upon the meaningless and arbitrary fiat of gods or demons. Put like that, of course, it is not an attitude which could be or was grasped by all or even by most Greeks. It was an attitude which had to make its way in a world permeated with irrationality and superstition. Nevertheless, it was a revolutionary and beneficial idea. It looked forward to the possibility of a society where such an attitude would be generalized. Even Plato, who thought it impossible that most men could share it, gave to the rulers of his ideal state the task of rational reflection as the justification both of their privileges and of their discipline laid upon them. The Greek challenge to the weight of irrationality in social and intellectual activity tempered its force as it had never been tempered before. For all the subsequent exaggeration and myth making about it, the liberating effect of this emphasis was felt again and again for thousands of years. It was the greatest single Greek achievement. This was so big a revolution in modes of thought in the Aegean that it now obscures its own scale. So remarkable are the works of the Greek intellectuals, and so large have they loomed in that it requires effort to penetrate through them to the values of the world from which they emerged. It made a little easier because no such revolution is ever complete. A look at the other side of the coin reveals that most Greeks continued to live in cocoons of traditional irrationality and superstition. Even those who were in a position to understand something of the speculations which were opening new mental worlds rarely accepted the implications. A continuing respect was shown to the old public orthodoxies. It was impiety in the late 5th century Athens, for example, to deny belief in the gods. One philosopher believed that the sun was a red hot disk. It did not protect him that he had been the friend of Pericles when he said so, and he had to flee. It was at Athens too that public opinion was convulsed on the eve of the Sicilian expedition by the mysterious and ominous mutilation of certain public statues, the Hermae or the busts of Hermes. The disasters which followed were attributed by some to this sacrilege. Socrates, the Athenian philosopher who became, thanks to his pupil Plato, the archetypal figure of a man of intellect, and left as a maxim the view that the unexamined life is not worth living, offended the pieties of his state and was condemned to die for it by his fellow citizens. He was also condemned for questioning received astronomy. It does not seem that similar trials took place elsewhere, but they imply a background of popular superstition which must have been more typical of the Greek community than the presence of a Socrates. In spite of such important historical residues, Greek thought, more than that of any earlier civilization, reflected changes of emphasis and fashion. They arose from its own dynamism and did not always lead to a greater ability to grapple with nature and society, rather than surrender to them, but sometimes to dead ends and blind alleys, to exotic and extravagant fantasies. Greek thought is not monolithic. We should think not of a block with a unity pervading all its part, but of a historical continuum extending across 3 or 4 centuries in which different elements are prominent at different times and which is hard to assess. One reason of this is that Greek categories of thought, the way, so to speak, in which they laid out the intellectual map before beginning to think about its individual components in detail at all, are not our own, though often deceptively like them. Some of those which we use did not exist for the Greeks, and their knowledge led them to draw different boundaries between fields of inquiry from those which we take for granted. Sometimes this is obvious and presents no difficulties. When a philosopher, for example, locates the management of a household and its estate as a part of a study of what we should call politics, we are not likely to misunderstand him. In more abstract topics, it can cause trouble. One example is to be found in Greek science. For us, science seems to be an appropriate way of approaching the understanding of the physical universe, and its techniques are those of empirical experiment and observation. Greek thinkers found the nature of the physical universe just as approachable through abstract thought as through metaphysics, logic, and mathematics. It has been said that Greek rationality actually came in the end to stand in the way of scientific progress because inquiry followed logic and abstract deduction rather than the observation of nature. Among the great Greek philosophers, only Aristotle gave prominence to collecting and classifying data, and he did this for the most part only in his social and biological studies. This is one reason for not separating the history of Greek science and philosophy too violently. They are a whole, the product of scores of cities and developing across 4 centuries or so in time. Their beginnings constitute a revolution in human thought, and it has already taken place when there appears the earliest Greek thinkers of whom we have information. They lived in the Ionian city of Miletus in the 7th century and the 6th century BC. Important intellectual activity went on there and in other Ionian cities right down to the remarkable age of Athenian speculation, which begins with Socrates. No doubt the stimulus of an Asian background was important here, as in so many other ways in getting things started. It may also have been significant that Miletus was a rich place. Early thinkers seem to have been rich men who could afford the time to think. Nonetheless, the early emphasis on Ionia gives way before long to a spectrum of intellectual activity going on all over the Greek world. The western settlements of Magna Graecia and Sicily were crucial in many 6th and 5th century developments, and primacy in the later Hellenistic age was to go to Alexandria. The whole Greek world was involved in success of the Greek mind, and even the great age of Athenian questioning should not be given exaggerated standing within it.